Hey guys, tonight we step back in time, far from the hustle and bustle of our modern lives, into a world of hushed reverence, devout labor, and the quiet, fragrant secrets of the earth. We're journeying to medieval Europe to explore what the monks of old were diligently, almost secretly, cultivating within their cloistered walls, specifically in their Physic gardens. Imagine stone enclosures, the air thick with the scent of unknown herbs, and figures in simple robes tending to plants that hold the power of life, or at least the power to soothe. And here's your medieval reality check if you were suddenly transported there with a common ailment, say a nasty infection or a raging fever. Your chances of survival without the monk's know-how, however rudimentary it might seem to us, would be, shall we say, spectacularly grim. You probably wouldn't survive this one, at least not without a prayer and a poultice. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. So, drop that in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your journey begins as you approach the imposing stone walls of a medieval monastery, perhaps nestled in a secluded valley in 12th century France, or perched on a windswept hill in Anglo-Saxon England. The world outside these walls is often chaotic, a patchwork of feudal loyalties, sporadic warfare, and the ever-present threat of famine and disease. But as you pass through the heavy gates into the monastery precinct, a profound sense of order and tranquility envelops you. This is a world apart, a self-contained community dedicated to prayer, study, and labor, ora et labora, as the rule of saint. Benedict famously prescribed, the rhythmic chanting of psalms drifts from the chapel, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a distant workshop, the lowing of cattle from the monastic grange. Everything here has its place, its purpose, its rhythm, dictated by the canonical hours and the changing seasons. And central to this ordered existence, vital for its self-sufficiency, are the gardens. Not just one manicured lawn for leisurely strolls. Oh no, medieval monastic gardens were intensely practical, hard-working spaces. You'd find the kitchen garden, or hortus, bursting with leeks, onions, cabbages, and beans, essential for the monk's often meager vegetarian diet. There would be an orchard, heavy with apples, pears, or plums, providing fruit for eating, cider for drinking, and perhaps even ingredients for a special festive treat. You might find a vineyard, if the climate allowed, for the production of wine used both in the sacrament and for daily consumption, often watered down. Of course, these were men of God, not a perpetual frat party, and then, usually tucked away in a quiet, accessible spot, often near the infirmary building, you would discover a very special, meticulously tended plot, the Physic garden. This is our cloistered green haven, the herbularius or hortus medicus. It might not be vast, perhaps a series of raised beds neatly arranged in geometric patterns, enclosed by a wattle fence or a low stone wall to keep out wandering animals and perhaps curious novices. But within its modest confines, a living apothecary thrives. The air here is different, a complex tapestry of scents, the sharp tang of sage, the sweet perfume of lavender, the subtle spice of thyme, the earthy notes of comfrey, and a dozen other fragrances, some familiar, some alien to your modern nose. This isn't a garden grown for beauty alone. Though there is a certain austere charm to its orderly rows, every plant here has a purpose, a potential use in the ongoing battle against sickness and suffering. This was, quite literally, the monastery's pharmacy, cultivated with skill, patience, and a profound sense of duty. The why behind these Physic gardens is deeply rooted in the core tenets of monastic life. A key mainstream historical fact is that the rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many Western monasteries, explicitly stated, before all things and above all things, care must be taken of the sick, so that they may be served as if they were truly Christ. This directive made healthcare a fundamental responsibility of the monastic community, In an era when trained physicians were scarce, especially outside major urban centers, and medical knowledge was often a confusing blend of folklore, superstition, and fragmented classical learning, monasteries often stood as islands of healing and compassionate care, not just for their own brethren, but frequently for the local laity as well. The infirmarian, the monk tasked with caring for the sick, relied heavily on the resources of the Physic garden to prepare remedies. What exactly were they growing in these dedicated plots? We'll delve into the specifics of these herbal remedies in later sections. But for now, imagine rows of plants chosen not for the size of their blooms or the sweetness of their fruit, but for the properties locked within their leaves, roots, seeds, and flowers. Each plant was a potential weapon against fevers, infections, digestive ailments, wounds, and the myriad other afflictions that plagued medieval bodies. The monks who tended these gardens were not just horticulturalists, they were guardians of ancient knowledge, practical herbalists, and, in their own way, medical pioneers. Now, for a quirky little tidbit, the very layout of these Physic gardens, often in neat squares or rectangular beds, wasn't just for ease of access and cultivation. Some scholars suggest that these ordered designs also reflected the medieval love of symbolism and the concept of the ordered universe, a microcosm of God's creation within the cloister walls. Furthermore, historians still argue whether the earliest monastic Physic gardens were highly specialized from their inception, dedicated solely to medicinal plants, or if they gradually evolved from more general-purpose herb and vegetable plots as specific healing knowledge became more concentrated within the monastery. It's a fascinating chicken or egg question for the archaeobotanists among us. So, you stand at the edge of this quiet, fragrant enclosure. The sun warms the earth, bees hum among the blossoms, and a solitary monk, his cowl pushed back, carefully weeds around a cluster of feathery fennel. It seems an idyll of peace. Yet this garden is a front line in a constant, quiet war against pain and mortality. It's a place of hope, a testament to human ingenuity, and a profound expression of faith, all cultivated in the humble soil. These monks weren't just praying for miracles, they were actively trying to grow them. One healing herb at a time, and trying to figure out which plant did what without Google. Now that's what I call a challenge. You're standing now at the edge of that serene, almost impossibly green Physic garden within the monastery walls, the air fragrant with 100 nascent remedies. We've glimpsed its orderly beds, its quiet purpose, a testament to the monks' dedication to healing. But that quiet, ordered garden and the infirmary it served didn't exist in a vacuum. To truly understand why these cloistered green havens were so vital, so painstakingly cultivated, you need to step outside those peaceful walls for a moment, into the often harsh and unforgiving reality of medieval life. You need to feel the chill wind that carried sickness, and understand the pervasive vulnerability that stalked the people of that era. It was, quite frankly, a world of hurt, where the need for any form of tangible healing was profoundly, desperately felt. Imagine yourself for a moment not as a robed monk with access to books in a dedicated garden, but as a peasant in a small village, or an artisan in a crowded, unsanitary town. Your daily life is one of hard physical labor. From sunrise to sunset, your home is likely a simple yet smoky hut with an earthen floor, shared perhaps with a few animals seeking warmth in winter. Not exactly a recipe for germ-free living. Sanitation, as we understand it, is virtually non-existent. Waste is often thrown into the street or the nearest river, which might also be your source of drinking water. You've probably never heard of germs. Illness is more likely to be attributed to bad air miasma, an imbalance of your body's humors blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, divine displeasure, or even witchcraft. It's a world where a simple cut from a farming tool, a broken bone, or difficult childbirth could easily become a death sentence. Trying to explain the concept of hand sanitizer here would probably get you branded as a sorcerer. And the diseases. Oh, the diseases. This is a stark mainstream historical fact. Medieval Europe was characterized by high infant and child mortality rates. A generally short life expectancy, though this average is skewed by the sheer number of childhood deaths. If you survived childhood, you had a better chance of reaching middle or even old age, and the constant, terrifying presence of infectious diseases. Dysentery, often called the bloody flux, could sweep through a community, leaving a trail of death, outbreaks of influenza, pneumonia, measles, and smallpox were common and feared. Leprosy, though perhaps not as widespread as often imagined, was a horrifying affliction that led to social ostracism. And this is all before the Black Death arrived in the mid-14th century to wipe out a staggering portion of Europe's population. An unimaginable catastrophe that only amplified existing fears. Even without a major plague, malnutrition was rife, leading to weakened immune systems and conditions like scurvy or rickets. Dental abscesses could be fatal. Skin infections, parasites, and persistent coughs were just part of the background noise of daily existence. That prayer and a poultice approach we mentioned earlier wasn't a joke. It was often the best available option. So, what did you do if you fell ill outside the relative security of a well-equipped monastery? Your options were limited and often alarming. Trained physicians, those who had perhaps studied the ancient Greek and Roman texts, were few and far between, incredibly expensive, and mostly served the nobility or wealthy merchants in larger cities. For most people, healthcare came from local sources, perhaps a wise woman in the village who knew some traditional herbal remedies, or a barber surgeon. Barbers, accustomed to working with sharp blades, often performed minor surgical procedures like bloodletting, tooth extraction, or lancing boils, usually without anesthetic, and with a very hazy understanding of infection control. You really were taking your life in your hands if you needed more than a bit of mending. And this brings us to a rather quirky and often terrifying aspect of medieval medicine, the sheer strangeness of some common treatments. Bloodletting, based on the theory of balancing humors, was prescribed for almost everything, from fevers to faintness, often weakening the patient further. You might be given amulets containing bizarre ingredients, dried toad, a wolf's tooth, or a bag of questionable relics, to ward off evil spirits or disease. Astrology played a significant role, with physicians consulting star charts to determine the most auspicious time for treatment. Some remedies involved incantations. Others involved ingesting potions made from things like powdered earthworms, animal dung, or even more unsavory components. It's a wonder anyone survived the treatments, let alone the diseases. Modern clinical trials would have had a field day, or perhaps a collective breakdown. Living with such constant vulnerability to sickness, injury, and early death must have had a profound psychological impact. Historians still argue whether the pervasive threat of illness and early death in medieval society fostered a greater sense of communal solidarity and mutual support as people rallied together in the face of shared adversity, or if it led to a more stoic, perhaps even fatalistic, acceptance of suffering as an inevitable part of the human condition. Did it make communities stronger? Or just more resigned? It was likely a complex mix of both, varying from person to person, region to region. Against this backdrop of widespread suffering and often ineffective or dangerous medical practices, the efforts of the monks in their infirmaries and physics gardens, however limited by our modern scientific understanding, begin to shine with a clearer light. Their approach, rooted in observation however flawed, the preservation of ancient texts, and a Christian duty of care, offered a more systematic and generally gentler alternative. That quiet haven of green, with its rows of carefully cultivated herbs, wasn't just a pretty feature of the monastery. It was a vital outpost in the relentless medieval struggle for health and survival. A place where knowledge, compassion, and the bounty of the earth were brought together in a desperate, yet hopeful, quest for healing. You're now acutely aware of the world of hurt that existed just beyond, and often within, the monastery's stone embrace. You understand the rampant diseases, the perilous accidents, and the often terrifyingly inept medical care available to the average medieval soul. So, faced with this relentless tide of suffering, and driven by their Benedictine vow to care for the sick as if they were Christ himself, where did these dedicated monks turn for guidance? They couldn't just Google medieval flu symptoms or pop down to the local pharmacy for a course of antibiotics. No, their path to healing knowledge was far more arduous. A quiet, scholarly pursuit undertaken in the hushed, hallowed halls of the monastery itself, relying on the wisdom of ages long past. Your journey takes you now into the monastery's scriptorium, often a cold, drafty room, but one illuminated by the precious light of learning. Here, hunched over sloping desks, monks dedicated their lives to the painstaking, almost sacred task of copying manuscripts. The only sounds are the rhythmic scratch of quill pens on parchment, the occasional rustle of a turning page, perhaps a stifled cough. The air smells of ink, often homemade from oak galls or soot, and the slightly musty animal scent of parchment, which was usually made from sheep or calfskin. This quiet, laborious work was the bedrock of knowledge preservation in a world where books were incredibly rare and valuable, each one a handcrafted treasure. You'd need incredible patience and probably very good eyesight, or at least a sturdy pair of those early, clunky spectacles if you were lucky. And what were they copying with such diligence? This is a crucial mainstream historical fact. Monasteries, particularly those following the Benedictine tradition, became vital repositories of classical learning during the early Middle Ages, a period when many ancient texts were lost or forgotten in much of Western Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire. Among the scrolls and codices they preserved were invaluable medical treatises from Greek and Roman antiquity. Imagine a monk carefully unrolling a fragile papyrus scroll or opening a heavy-bound codex, his eyes tracing lines of Latin, or perhaps even Greek if he were particularly learned. He would be communing with minds like Hippocrates, the legendary father of medicine from ancient Greece, whose writings emphasized careful observation of symptoms and the importance of diet and environment. He'd encounter Galen of Pergamon, a Roman physician whose voluminous works expanded on Hippocratic ideas, detailing anatomy though often based on animal dissections, leading to some, shall we say, interesting conclusions about human bodies, and providing extensive lists of medicinal substances. Perhaps the most thumbed-through medical text in the scriptorium, especially for the monk in charge of the Physic garden, the Infirmarians, would be Dioscorides de Materia Medica. This monumental work from the 1st century AD was the foundational herbal text for centuries, meticulously describing hundreds of plants, animals, and minerals and their supposed medicinal properties. Pliny the Elder's natural history also contained a wealth of information on medicinal plants, mixed in with all sorts of other fascinating, and sometimes fantastical, observations about the natural world. These texts were the monks' primary medical textbooks, their encyclopedias of healing. Trying to decipher some of that ancient handwriting, faded ink on aged parchment, must have been even worse than trying to read a doctor's prescription today. Of course, the process wasn't without its challenges. These ancient texts were often scarce, and acquiring a copy for the monastery library could be a major undertaking. Language was another hurdle. Many key texts were originally in Greek, and translations into Latin, the lingua franca of the medieval church, could be of variable quality, sometimes leading to misunderstandings or mistranslations that could have, shall we say, interesting effects on the resulting remedies. Imagine a slight mistranslation turning a recipe for a soothing lotion into a recipe for, well, something much less soothing. Parchment was expensive, so sometimes older texts were scraped clean and reused, creating palimpsests where faint traces of lost knowledge might still lurk beneath a newer layer of writing. And then there was the practical challenge of matching the plant descriptions in a Mediterranean text by Dioscorides to the actual flora found growing in the damp climate of Northern Europe. Does this vaguely leaf-shaped smudge in the drawing look like the thing growing by the stream? Brother Michael. The monks didn't just blindly copy, however. They were working within a profoundly Christian worldview, and historians still argue whether the monastic engagement with classical medical texts was primarily an act of rote preservation, faithfully copying what was before them, or if it involved a more dynamic process of interpretation, selection, and adaptation to fit their specific needs, local resources, and prevailing Christian worldview. They would have seen this ancient wisdom not as contradictory to their faith, but as part of God's benevolent provision for humanity, a way to understand the healing properties he had imbued in his creation. And this brings us to a quirky and fascinating way of thinking about plants that often mingled with classical knowledge the early stirrings of what later became known as the doctrine of signatures. While it wasn't fully systematized until much later, the idea that God had signed plants to indicate their medicinal uses was already present. So, a plant with heart-shaped leaves might be considered good for the heart. Lungwort, with its spotted leaves resembling diseased lungs, was used for respiratory ailments. Walnuts, looking like tiny brains, were thought to benefit the head. It was a kind of divine labeling system, an intuitive, if not exactly scientific, approach to understanding nature's pharmacy. So, the infirmarian monk, responsible for the Physic garden and the care of his sick brethren, was more than just a gardener or a nurse. He was often a scholar in his own right, poring over these ancient texts, trying to decipher their secrets, and then translating that knowledge into the practical cultivation of healing herbs and the preparation of remedies. He was a crucial link in a chain of knowledge stretching back over 1,000 years. A quiet guardian of ancient wisdom in a world that desperately needed every scrap of healing it could find. Armed with the wisdom gleaned from those ancient, precious scrolls of Hippocrates, Galen, and Dioscorides, knowledge painstakingly copied and preserved in the chilly scriptorium. The infirmarian monk steps out into the fresh air and gentle sunlight of his Physic garden. He exchanges the scent of old parchment and ink for the vibrant, complex perfumes of living plants. This is where theory meets practice, where ancient remedies are given new life through careful cultivation. And it's here, among the neatly ordered beds we envisioned earlier, that you'll encounter the workhorses of monastic medicine, the sacred simples, the common gentle healers used for the everyday ailments and discomforts of monastic life, and often for the layfolk who sought help at the monastery gates. A simple, in medieval herbal terms, refers to a medicinal preparation made from a single plant, as opposed to a complex compound of many ingredients. These simples were the first line of defense, the trusted allies in managing the coughs, colds, upset stomachs, minor wounds, and anxieties that were a constant feature of life, even within the relatively sheltered environment of the cloister. Think of the Physic garden as a living, breathing medicine cabinet, each plant offering its unique virtues, and a very well-organized one at that. No rummaging for an out-of-date bottle at the back here, just fresh, vital ingredients waiting to be picked. You walk along the narrow pathways between the raised beds, and the air itself feels therapeutic, alive with a symphony of scents. Let's meet some of these key players, the gentle giants of the herbal world. A mainstream historical fact is that herbs we often consider culinary today were medicinal powerhouses back then. Take sage Salvia officinalis, its gray-green, slightly fuzzy leaves releasing a sharp, clean aroma when brushed. Its very name comes from the Latin salvare, meaning to save or to heal. Monks would have used sage infusions for sore throats, coughs, and to aid digestion. Its antiseptic properties also made it useful for cleaning wounds. You'd likely see it growing in abundance. Nearby, you'd find sturdy bushes of Rosemary rosmarinus officinalis, its needle-like leaves exuding a piney, invigorating fragrance. The infirmarian might tell you it's excellent for clearing the head, improving memory useful for monks memorizing long psalters, and stimulating circulation. A sprig of rosemary tucked into a book or worn on the person was thought to ward off illness, and its smoke could fumigate a sick room. Then there's thyme thymus vulgaris, a low-growing aromatic herb, its tiny leaves packed with a warm, pungent scent. Monks valued thyme for its antiseptic qualities, using it in preparations for coughs, chest complaints, and as a digestive aid. A little thyme in the daily pottage might have been seen as both a flavoring and a preventative. You'd certainly encounter various types of mint mentha species. From spearmint to peppermint, their refreshing, cool scents unmistakable. A soothing mint tea would be a go-to remedy for an upset stomach, nausea, or a throbbing headache after too much squinting at manuscripts in dim light. And Fennel funiculum vulgare, with its feathery leaves and anise-like aroma, was another digestive champion, often used for colic in infants if the monastery cared for foundlings or for flatulence, a very real, if unglamorous, concern, even for holy men. A rather charming quirky tidbit is that monks, and indeed many medieval people, often chewed fennel seeds during long fasts or periods of Lenten abstinence, as they were believed to suppress hunger pangs and freshen the breath. Talk about a medieval diet hack. For troubles of a more nervous disposition, or for simply encouraging rest in the often uncomfortable conditions of a medieval infirmary. Certain herbs were indispensable. Lavender lavandula angustifolia, with its iconic purple spikes and calming sweet scent, would be grown for its ability to soothe anxiety, relieve headaches, and promote sleep. Bunches of lavender might be hung in the dormitory or infirmary, not just for its pleasant aroma, but also to repel moths and other unwelcome insectile visitors. It was the medieval equivalent of a luxury spa day, all from one plant. And then there's gentle chamomile matricaria, chamomilla, or chamomellum noble, its small, daisy-like flowers exuding a delicate apple-like fragrance. A warm infusion of chamomile was a sovereign remedy for calming fretful patients, easing an upset stomach or reducing inflammation. For the inevitable cuts, scrapes, bruises, and burns that came with manual labor or simple accidents. The Physic garden offered its own array of soothing and healing agents. You'd find the broad-leaved plantain plantago major, often dismissed as a common weed today, but highly valued by medieval herbalists. Its crushed leaves made an excellent poultice for drawing out infection, soothing insect bites and stings, and staunching minor bleeding. Nearby might be Comfrey symphodum officinale, sometimes known as knitbone, its large, hairy leaves yielding a mucilaginous substance believed to help mend broken bones and heal stubborn wounds and sprains. And the cheerful orange or yellow faces of calendula, Calendula officinalis, or pot marigold, would not only brighten the garden but also provide petals for making soothing salves and washes for burns, rashes, and inflamed skin. The efficacy of these simple remedies is, of course, a subject of ongoing discussion. Historians still argue whether the consistent use and perceived effectiveness of these sacred simples for common ailments was primarily due to their actual, albeit mild, pharmacological properties, which modern science has indeed confirmed for many of these herbs, or the powerful combination of faith in God's provision, attentive nursing care by the monks, and the significant influence of the placebo effect in a deeply religious society. It was likely a potent cocktail of all these factors. The infirmarian wasn't just dispensing herbs, he was dispensing hope, compassion, and the accumulated wisdom of his order. These weren't dramatic, life-saving interventions for the most part, but rather a gentle, sustained effort to alleviate discomfort, promote healing, and provide comfort using the readily available gifts of the earth. In a world so full of harshness, the Physic garden offered a small, fragrant pocket of solace and practical care. Cultivated with devotion and a deep understanding of nature's subtle powers, you've spent some time now among the sacred simples of the monastic Physic garden, haven't you? You've inhaled the comforting aromas of lavender and chamomile, appreciated the sturdy usefulness of sage and plantain, those gentle healers that soothed the everyday aches, pains, and anxieties of medieval life. You've seen how the infirmarian monk, guided by ancient texts and careful observation, could bring relief with a simple herbal tea or a soothing poultice. But the medieval world, as we've established, often dealt blows far too severe for these gentle remedies alone. And so, in the more secluded corners of that same physics garden, or perhaps in a specially designated, carefully watched area, you would find a different class of plant altogether: the potent, the powerful, and the potentially perilous. These weren't the herbs you'd casually sprinkle into your soup or strew on the floor for a pleasant scent. These were the heavy artillery of the monastic apothecary, plants that demanded profound respect, meticulous handling, and an intimate understanding of their capabilities and their dangers. When faced with excruciating pain from a badly broken limb, a raging fever that wouldn't break, the agony of kidney stones, or the need to render a patient sufficiently insensible for a rudimentary surgical procedure like setting a bone or excising a growth, the infirmarian sometimes had to reach for something stronger, something that walked a knife edge between healing and harm. It's like upgrading from a calming cup of chamomile tea to something that requires a hazardous material suit and a very steady hand. This is where we encounter a mainstream historical fact. Monastic infirmarians, through their study of classical texts and accumulated experience, did possess knowledge of, and sometimes cultivated plants, with highly potent psychoactive and physiological effects. Chief among these were members of the Solanaceae family, commonly known as the nightshades, a family with a decidedly mixed reputation, containing both valuable medicines and deadly poisons. You might find henbane Hyoscyamus niger, a rather sinister-looking plant with sticky, hairy leaves and lurid yellow-purple flowers. Its seeds and leaves contain powerful alkaloids like hyoscyamine and scopolamine. In carefully controlled, minute doses, henbane could be used as a sedative, an analgesic especially for toothache or rheumatic pains, and an antispasmodic. But even a small miscalculation could lead to delirium, terrifying hallucinations, and death. It wasn't a plant to be trifled with. Then there's Belladonna atropa. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, with its alluring, shiny black berries that could tempt an unwary child. Every part of this plant is highly toxic, containing atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. Its name, belladonna, meaning beautiful lady in Italian, refers to its historical use by women to dilate their pupils for a supposedly more attractive appearance. A risky cosmetic choice, to say the least. Medically, in vanishingly small and precise amounts, it could be used to reduce secretions, relieve muscle spasms, or as a component in sedative preparations. But again, the margin for error was incredibly slim. The infirmarian handling this would need nerves of steel and the precision of a watchmaker. And what about Mandrake mandragora officinarum? This plant was steeped in folklore, its thick, often forked root fabled to resemble a human form. Ancient texts, which the monks would have known, described mandrake as a powerful soporific and anesthetic. Its root, often mixed with wine, could induce a deep stupor, making it invaluable for surgical procedures in an age before modern anesthetics. However, mandrake was also notoriously dangerous, with a high risk of overdose leading to coma or death. Its harvest was surrounded by a wealth of superstitions, the most famous being that the plant would emit a blood-curdling shriek when pulled from the earth, instantly killing anyone who heard it. This led to a rather quirky and elaborate harvesting ritual described in some old texts, involving tying a dog to the plant to do the actual pulling, while the harvester stood at a safe distance with blocked ears. While the monks, with their learning, might have been skeptical of the shriek, such deeply ingrained folklore would have undoubtedly underscored the plant's fearsome reputation and the caution required in its handling. Forget your quiet chamomile. This was the rock star of the Physic garden, complete with dangerous groupies. Perhaps the most widely recognized of these potent plants was the opium poppy papaver somniferum. Its beautiful, ephemeral flowers giving little hint of the powerful substance locked within its unripe seed pods. Monks knew how to harvest the raw opium, a gummy latex, and prepare it for use as one of the most effective painkillers and sedatives available in the medieval world. Preparations of opium, perhaps mixed with wine or other herbs, could bring blessed relief from unbearable pain or induce a deep, restful sleep. But opium was then as now a double-edged sword, highly effective, but also highly addictive and potentially lethal in overdose. The knowledge of its preparation and dosage would have been among the infirmarian's most closely guarded secrets. The use of such powerful substances highlights the incredible responsibility that rested on the infirmarian's shoulders. The line between a therapeutic dose and a toxic one was often incredibly fine. Historians still argue whether the documented monastic use of highly potent plants like henbane or opium poppy was a relatively common practice for managing severe pain and inducing sedation in dire circumstances, or if it was an extremely rare last resort measure, given the profound risks and the potential for fatal miscalculation. These weren't everyday remedies, they were the big guns, brought out when the sacred simples were clearly overwhelmed. Access to these plants in the garden, and the knowledge of their preparation was likely restricted, passed down carefully from one experienced infirmarian to his successor, perhaps with hushed warnings and solemn oaths. Brother Thomas, this henbane, use about this much and pray. Use any more and you'll be praying for your patient's soul, and possibly your own. These potent petals and perilous roots paint a fuller picture of the monastic Physic garden, not just a place of gentle fragrances and soothing tisanes, but also a carefully controlled repository of nature's fiercest powers, wielded with a mixture of ancient wisdom, acquired skill, profound caution, and undoubtedly, a great deal of prayer. Having cautiously tiptoed past the plots of henbane and eyed the opium poppies with a healthy dose of respect, you've now encountered both the gentle simples and the more formidable botanical powerhouses nestled within the monastic Physic garden. You understand the critical importance of the plants themselves. But what about the space that cradled this living apothecary? How was it designed and organized? Let's take a broader look at the physical layout of these cloistered green havens. For their structure was as deliberate and purposeful as the remedies they yielded. It wasn't just a random patch of herbs, there was a distinct order in the earth. Imagine the infirmarian monk, responsible for a multitude of plants, each with its specific needs and properties. He needs to find the right herb quickly, especially in an emergency. He needs to cultivate them efficiently, protect them from the elements and pests, and ensure that the truly potent ones don't get mixed up with the everyday culinary varieties. Chaos in the Physic garden could have, shall we say, less than therapeutic consequences. Oops, that wasn't parsley I put in the soup. Brother Abbot. So order and clarity were paramount, reflecting the overall monastic emphasis on discipline and thoughtful arrangement in all aspects of life. A key mainstream historical fact is that monastic Physic gardens were typically characterized by a sense of regularity and careful planning. You wouldn't usually find a wild, rambling, cottage-style garden here. Instead, picture an enclosed space, often rectangular or square, protected by stone walls, a neatly woven wattle fence, or a thick hedge. This enclosure served multiple purposes. It kept out wandering livestock. A medieval goat could do a lot of damage to a prized patch of medicinal sage, provided some shelter from harsh winds, and, importantly, offered a degree of security and controlled access, especially if those more perilous plants we discussed were grown within. Inside the enclosure, the herbs were commonly cultivated in raised beds. These weren't just for show, like some modern garden trends. Raised beds, perhaps edged with timber, stones, or woven branches, provided better drainage, crucial in the often damp climates of northern Europe, and made the tasks of weeding, tending, and harvesting much easier on a monk's back. Nobody wants a slipped disc when they're reaching for the feverfew. These beds were often laid out in neat, geometric patterns, squares, rectangles, with clearly defined pathways between them. These paths, perhaps of beaten earth, gravel, or even grass if they were feeling fancy, allowed the infirmarian to move easily through the garden, accessing each plant without trampling its neighbors. You'd also expect a reliable water source nearby, Whether it was a well with a bucket, a cistern collecting rainwater, or even a diverted stream or rill as water was essential, especially for establishing new plants or during dry spells. And there might be a small, humble shed or lean-to for storing tools like spades, hose, and watering cans likely made of wood or pottery, as well as baskets for harvesting, and perhaps even a dedicated area for the initial drying or processing of some herbs. A famous example that gives us a glimpse into the ideal is the 9th century plan of St. Gall, a detailed architectural drawing of a complete Benedictine monastic complex. Though it was an ideal blueprint rather than a depiction of an actual existing monastery. It includes a dedicated Physic garden herbularius with 16 neatly labeled rectangular beds, each designated for a specific medicinal herb like sage, rosemary, mint, rue, and fennel. This plan, even if aspirational for many smaller monasteries, underscores the value placed on an organized approach. Beyond sheer practicality, there was often a deeper, symbolic dimension to the garden's layout. The medieval mind was attuned to finding spiritual meaning in the material world, and the garden was no exception. This leads to a rather intriguing, quirky tidbit: the design could incorporate symbolic numbers or shapes. For instance, a garden might be divided into 12 beds, perhaps representing the 12 apostles or the 12 months of the year. Sometimes paths would form a cross shape, dividing the garden into 4 quadrants, which could symbolize the 4 Gospels, the 4 corners of the earth, or even the 4 humors that medieval medicine sought to balance. The enclosed garden itself, the hortus conclusus, was a powerful medieval symbol, often associated with the Virgin Mary or the lost paradise of Eden, a pure, protected space where healing and contemplation could flourish. So, when a monk was meticulously aligning his rows of herbs, he might have been aiming for more than just a tidy garden. He might have been trying to create a small reflection of divine order on earth. Brother Cuthbert, are your comfrey lines perfectly parallel? God is watching, you know, and so is the abbot. Naturally, the extent to which such elaborate symbolism or idealized plans like St. Gall's were realized in everyday practice is a matter of discussion. Archaeologists and historians still argue whether the highly structured and often symbolically rich layouts depicted in ideal monastic plans were common, practical realities in most working monasteries, or if these represent more of an aspirational blueprint, with actual Physic gardens often being simpler, more vernacular creations shaped by local constraints, available space, and the individual infirmarian's personal experience and preferences. A small, impoverished priory would have had a far more modest setup than a wealthy, influential abbey. But whether grand or humble, intricately symbolic or starkly practical, the Physic garden was a space defined by its order. It was a carefully curated collection, a living library of healing, where every plant had its place and its purpose. This organization was essential for the safe and effective use of its contents, ensuring that the monk seeking a soothing balm for a brother's burn didn't accidentally reach for something that would, shall we say, make the situation considerably more fiery. The very layout of the garden was a testament to the monks' methodical approach to both their spiritual and earthly responsibilities. This beautifully ordered Physic garden, with its neatly arranged beds showcasing both those gentle, sacred simples and the more formidable, potent plants we've encountered, didn't just magically appear or tend itself. Its vibrant life, its careful organization, and its crucial role in monastic healthcare all revolved around one key figure: the monastic infirmarian, the dedicated healing hand within the cloister. So, let's pull back the cowl, figuratively speaking, and get to know this remarkable individual, the monk entrusted with the health and well-being of his brethren. The infirmarian, or infirmarius in Latin, wasn't just any monk assigned a random chore. This was a specific and highly respected office within the monastery, a role underscored by that powerful Benedictine injunction. You'll recall, before all things and above all things, care must be taken of the sick. The monk chosen for this duty was likely someone with a natural aptitude for healing, a compassionate nature, a keen eye for observation, or perhaps a scholarly inclination towards the medical texts housed in the monastery's scriptorium. Or, in some cases, he might have been simply the most capable or least squeamish brother available for a demanding job. It wasn't a role for the faint of heart, especially given the often grim realities of medieval ailments. Forget choosing a cool elective, this was a serious life and death calling. His responsibilities were vast and varied, a cornerstone mainstream historical fact of monastic life. First and foremost, he was the primary caregiver for any monks who fell ill or became too frail in old age. This meant managing the infirmary, a separate building or wing within the monastery designed to house the sick. He would ensure it was kept as clean as medieval standards allowed, which, admittedly, might still make you shudder, that there was warmth from a fire in winter, and that patients received appropriate food, often specially prepared and more nourishing than the standard monastic diet. He was, in essence, the head nurse ward manager, and often the sole physician on site. Beyond direct patient care, the infirmarian was the master of the Physic garden. He would plan its layout, decide which herbs to cultivate based on the monastery's needs and the knowledge gleaned from those ancient texts by Dioscorides and Galen. He'd oversee the planting, weeding, watering, and, crucially, the timely harvesting of these medicinal plants, ensuring they were picked when their virtues were thought to be at their peak. He was a botanist, a horticulturalist, and a pharmacist all rolled into one. His thumbs weren't just green, they were life-savingly green. And then came the preparation of remedies. Armed with his harvest, the infirmarian would retreat to a dedicated space, perhaps a small room attached to the infirmary or a corner of the storehouse, to transform these raw plants into usable medicines. He'd be skilled in drying herbs to preserve them, pounding roots and seeds in a mortar, infusing leaves and flowers in hot water to make tisanes, or simmering them in fats or oils to create salves and ointments. He had to understand the properties of each simple and how they might be combined. Though complex polypharmacy was perhaps less common in the early days than a reliance on the singular virtues of individual plants. He might also have been responsible for keeping records, noting which remedies seemed effective for particular ailments, or perhaps even contributing his own observations to the monastery's store of medical knowledge. So, where did he get all this know-how? As we've discussed, the classical texts preserved in the scriptorium were a primary source. But equally important was the practical, often unwritten, knowledge passed down from previous infirmarians. Imagine an aging infirmarian carefully teaching his apprentice the subtle differences between similar-looking plants, the precise way to prepare a particular poultice, or the traditional uses of a local herb not mentioned in the ancient Greek texts. This oral tradition, combined with the infirmarian's own careful observation and, undoubtedly, some cautious trial and error, formed the backbone of monastic medical practice. He might even correspond with infirmarians in other monasteries, exchanging seeds, remedies, or useful tips, creating an informal network of shared learning. It was like a very slow, parchment-based medical forum. It's quite fascinating to consider a quirky tidbit here. Some infirmarians may well have developed their own specialty remedies or unique variations on traditional recipes. Perhaps Brother Anselm's cough syrup was particularly renowned throughout the local countryside. Or Sister Hildegard, though a nun, not a monk. Her medical contributions were immense and similar in spirit, had a secret recipe for a healing salve. These unique formulations, born of experience and local resources, might have been recorded in personal notebooks, if they were written down at all, or perhaps only passed on verbally to a trusted successor, like a closely guarded family secret. They might even have had specific prayers or chants they would recite while gathering or preparing certain potent herbs. Believing this imbued the medicine with an extra measure of divine grace. The true extent of their professionalism by modern standards is, of course, open to interpretation. Historians still argue whether the average monastic infirmarian possessed a level of empirical medical skill and diagnostic acumen significantly superior to contemporary lay herbalists and folk healers, or if their primary advantage lay in better access to classical texts, a more stable environment for practice, and the institutional support of the monastery. Whatever the case, their dedication was undeniable. They were the quiet heroes of the cloister, battling suffering with the tools they had: ancient wisdom, the bounty of their garden, and a profound sense of compassion. Their bedside manner was probably very calm, very quiet, and punctuated by a lot of prayer, which, to be fair, might be preferable to a medieval barber surgeon cheerfully brandishing a saw. The weight of responsibility on the infirmarian was immense. The health of his community, the easing of pain, the comfort of the dying, these were all part of his daily charge. He was the healing hand within, a figure of hope and practical care in a world that often offered little of either. You've met the dedicated infirmarian, that quiet hero of the monastery, whose life revolved around tending the sick and nurturing the Physic garden. You've seen the ancient texts that guided his hand, and the carefully ordered beds where both gentle simples and potent botanicals grew. Now, let's follow him from the sun-dappled garden into the hushed, aromatic confines of his laboratory, the monastic pharmacy, such as it was. This is where the real transformation happens, where humble leaf and root become healing linctus, soothing salve, or comforting tisane. It's a place of meticulous preparation, ancient recipes, and a good deal of earthly know-how. Imagine a small, functional room, perhaps attached to the infirmary for easy access, or tucked away near the kitchen where a fire might be readily available. The air here is thick with a complex medley of scents: the dry, dusty aroma of stored herbs, the sharp tang of pounded seeds, the sweet fragrance of honey, perhaps a hint of beeswax or simmering fats. Bunches of herbs, lavender, sage, feverfew hang drying from the rafters, rustling gently in any stray draft. Along the walls, rough wooden shelves hold earthenware jars, wooden boxes, and linen bags, some perhaps with crudely written labels, containing the dried bounty of past harvests. This isn't a gleaming modern laboratory with stainless steel and precise measuring devices, but a rustic workshop where the infirmarian, with focused intent, practices his healing craft. You won't find any lab coats here, just a monk with his sleeves rolled up, ready to get his hands dirty for the cause of health. The first crucial step, after carefully harvesting plants from the Physic garden at what was believed to be their peak potency, perhaps early morning after the dew had dried, or during a specific phase of the moon for certain potent varieties, a fascinating, quirky tidbit to consider was preservation. Most herbs couldn't be used fresh year-round, so drying was essential. The infirmarian would spread them on clean cloths or specially made racks in a warm, airy, dark place, perhaps a loft or a dedicated drying room, to prevent mold and preserve their medicinal virtues. Once perfectly dry and brittle, they'd be carefully stored away, ready for use. It's like your grandma's attic, but instead of old photo albums, it's full of nature's first aid kit. Now, for the actual making of medicines. A true mainstream historical fact is the variety of methods monks employed. Perhaps the most common and straightforward were water-based preparations. For delicate leaves and flowers, like chamomile for calming or mint for digestion, an infusion or tisane was ideal. The infirmarian would pour hot but not usually boiling water over the herbs and let them steep, releasing their gentle properties. It's your basic herbal tea, but with a much more serious purpose. For tougher plant parts, roots like comfrey, bark, or seeds like fennel, a decoction was necessary. This involved simmering the plant material in water for a longer period to extract the desired compounds. These infusions and decoctions could be drunk, or used externally as soothing washes for wounds or skin irritations. For external applications, especially for wounds, burns, or skin conditions, oil or fat-based preparations were key. The infirmarian would create salves and ointments by slowly infusing herbs like calendula, plantain, or St. John's wort into a base of animal fat such as lard or lanolin from sheep's wool. If available, or plant oil like olive oil. If the monastery was wealthy enough or located in a region where olives grew, this mixture would be gently heated for hours, sometimes days, to allow the fat to absorb the herbal properties. Often, beeswax would be melted in at the end to give the salve a thicker consistency and help it adhere to the skin. Another common external remedy was a poultice. This involved crushing fresh or dried herbs and mixing them with a hot, moist medium like bread, oatmeal, or bran. This warm, medicated plaster would then be applied directly to an injury to draw out infection, reduce inflammation, or ease pain. Imagine a warm, herby hug for your boo-boos. Other preparations required different techniques. Dried herbs could be pounded into fine powders using a heavy mortar and pestle. These powders might be mixed with honey or wine to make them more palatable for internal use, or dusted directly onto wounds. For coughs and sore throats, the infirmarian would create syrups or linctuses by combining concentrated herbal extracts with honey, which acted as both a sweetener and a natural preservative, and had its own soothing properties. And while distilled alcohol became more common towards the later medieval period, the monks were certainly familiar with wine, and would sometimes create herbal wines or early forms of tinctures by steeping herbs in it. Alcohol is an excellent solvent for many plant compounds and also acts as a preservative. The array of preparations and the knowledge required to make them effectively leads to an interesting point of scholarly discussion. Medical historians and archaeologists still argue whether the majority of monastic remedy production focused on simple single herb preparations easily managed by one infirmarian with basic equipment, or if there's evidence for more widespread creation of complex compound medicines involving numerous precisely measured ingredients, akin to the elaborate recipes found in some of the more advanced classical and Arabic medical texts they possessed. It was likely a spectrum, with everyday ailments treated with simples and more complex and perhaps riskier compounds reserved for more serious or stubborn conditions. You watch the infirmarian at his work, carefully measuring dried leaves, patiently stirring a simmering pot, his movements practiced and unhurried. There's a quiet dignity to his labor, a blend of ancient tradition, practical skill, and a deep-seated desire to alleviate suffering. This isn't just cooking, it's a sacred art, transforming the gifts of the earth into tangible hope for the sick and afflicted. And if a remedy tasted absolutely foul, well, perhaps that was just an extra incentive for the patient to get well quickly. You've witnessed the infirmarian in his aromatic workshop, meticulously transforming the leaves, roots, and flowers from the Physic garden into potions, salves, and healing tisanes. It's serious, vital work, a testament to the monk's dedication to easing suffering. But the bounty of the monastic garden, that carefully cultivated patch of green, wasn't solely reserved for the sickbed or the infirmary shelf. Many of the same plants, and others grown alongside them, played a surprisingly varied role in the daily life of the monastery, extending far beyond poultices and pills. They added zest to meager meals, freshened the often stuffy cloistered air, and even contributed to the sacred atmosphere of worship. Let's first peek into the monastic kitchen. A mainstream historical fact is that herbs were indispensable for flavoring the often simple, repetitive, and largely vegetarian diet of the monks. Imagine the daily pottage is a thick stew of grains and whatever vegetables were available from the kitchen garden. Without the magic of herbs, it could be a pretty bland affair, day in and day out. But with a generous addition of sage, thyme, rosemary, parsley, marjoram, or savory from the garden, that humble dish could be transformed into something far more palatable, even enjoyable. These herbs, many of which we've already met in their medicinal capacity, did double duty, lending their aromatic oils to both healing concoctions and culinary creations. Mint could brighten a dish of beans. Fennel might be used with fish if the monastery's rules and location allowed it. And garlic, though sometimes viewed with suspicion by stricter orders for its heating properties, was undoubtedly cultivated and used where permitted for its robust flavor and known health benefits. Making bland food more interesting wasn't just about pleasure, it was practical. A more appealing meal meant better nourishment and perhaps even better morale among brethren engaged in long hours of prayer and hard labor. Brother Cook, are you sure this pottage doesn't have quite enough sage? I'm feeling distinctly unsaved today. Beyond the kitchen, herbs played a crucial role in maintaining a semblance of freshness and hygiene within the monastery buildings. Remember, medieval floors were often cold, damp stone or beaten earth, and cleanliness standards were, shall we say, different from our own. This is where strewing herbs came in. Monks would scatter fragrant plants like lavender, meadowsweet, hyssop, chamomile, mint, or sweet woodruff across the floors of the dormitory, the refectory dining hall, the chapter house, and even the chapel itself. As people walked on them, the herbs would release their pleasant aromas, helping to mask less agreeable odors. And let's be honest, in a communal living space without modern plumbing, there would have been a few. More importantly, many of these herbs were believed to repel fleas, lice, and other unwelcome insect pests, which were a constant nuisance. It was a kind of medieval air freshener and pest control, all in one fragrant carpet. Imagine the relief of walking into a room that smelled of lavender instead of, well, medieval socks and old rushes. Some herbs also found their way into personal care. Infusions of certain plants could be used as face washes or hair rinses. Sprigs of lavender or other fragrant herbs might be tucked into linen chests to keep clothes smelling sweet and deter moths. While full immersion baths were not a daily occurrence, when they did happen, fragrant herbs might be added to the water for a more pleasant and perhaps mildly cleansing experience. And in the realm of the sacred, garden products contributed to the atmosphere of worship. While wealthy monasteries could afford imported frankincense and myrrh for their censers, more humble establishments might supplement these with homegrown aromatics. Dried rosemary or lavender could be burned as incense, their fragrant smoke rising with the prayers. Some plants may have been used to create fragrant oils for anointing or to polish sacred vessels. Now, for a rather delightful, quirky tidbit that blurs the line between medicine and pleasure, the monastic tradition of creating herbal liqueurs or cordials. While famous names like Chartreuse or Benedictine, with their incredibly complex and secret recipes, have specific later origins. The general practice of monks infusing herbs in alcohol, wine, or later distilled spirits to create invigorating tonics. Digestive aids, or carminatives, has much older roots. These concoctions were often developed and produced by the infirmarian, initially for their perceived health benefits. A small glass of a potent herbal liqueur might be prescribed for a monk feeling faint or chilled, or to aid digestion after a particularly heavy by monastic standards meal. But let's be honest, these often quite potent and flavorful beverages were probably also enjoyed for their warming qualities, and offered to important guests as a sign of hospitality. It's medicinal, of course, purely for medicinal reasons. Brother Prior? Wink, wink. The versatility of these plants is truly remarkable. And it leads to an interesting discussion. Culinary historians and monastic scholars still argue whether the deliberate cultivation and extensive use of highly aromatic and flavorful herbs in monastic cooking was primarily a pragmatic strategy to make an often bland and restricted diet more palatable and digestible, or if it also subtly acknowledged and catered to a permissible level of sensory pleasure and enjoyment within the disciplined framework of an ascetic religious life. Was it all just about practical necessity? Or did the monks, in their quiet way, also appreciate the simple joy of a fragrant room or a tasty meal? From seasoning the soup to scenting the sacred space, from keeping pests at bay to perhaps providing a discreet nip of a restorative cordial? The herbs of the monastic garden were woven into the very fabric of daily existence, far beyond their purely medicinal roles. They demonstrate the monks' profound resourcefulness and their deep understanding of the manifold gifts offered by the green world growing just outside their cell doors. You've seen how the herbs from the monastic garden served not just the sick and ailing, but also flavored the monks' simple meals and freshened the air of their cloistered world. It's clear these plants were deeply practical, woven into the very fabric of daily life. But for the medieval monk, tending his rows of sage or carefully harvesting chamomile, there was another layer of meaning, a profound spiritual resonance that connected every leaf, every root, every fragrant blossom in that Physic garden to the divine. This wasn't just horticulture or folk medicine, it was, in a very real sense, an engagement with God's verdant pharmacy. Step into the mindset of that infirmarian monk for a moment. His worldview is thoroughly permeated by faith. The natural world, in all its astonishing diversity and complexity, is not a random assortment of matter, but the direct, purposeful handiwork of God. This is a fundamental tenet of medieval Christian thought. A mainstream historical fact, creation itself was seen as a vast book, filled with signs and symbols that pointed towards its creator. And within this grand design, plants, with their unique forms, colors, scents, and, crucially, their healing properties, were understood as a special gift, a tangible expression of God's benevolent providence for humanity. They weren't just there. They were there for a reason, placed on earth to sustain life, ease suffering, and reveal divine wisdom. Studying and utilizing these plants wasn't seen as arrogance or a turning away from God, but rather as a responsible and grateful use of his gifts. An act of good stewardship? This is where the fascinating concept we touched on earlier, the doctrine of signatures, finds its true spiritual home. Remember how this idea suggested that God had imprinted clues, or signatures, onto plants to indicate their medicinal uses. Lungwort, with its spotted leaves resembling diseased lungs, was surely intended for respiratory ailments. The bright, clear flower of eyebright, so perfectly mimicking a human eye, must be a remedy for ocular problems. The knobbly root of pilewort? Well, you can probably guess what that was thought to treat. To the medieval mind, especially one steeped in symbolism, this wasn't just wishful thinking, it was like deciphering a divine code, a direct communication from the Creator about how to use his pharmacy. The infirmarian, walking through his garden, wasn't just looking for healthy specimens, he was reading the signatures, seeking God's own prescription written in the language of leaf and flower. It's like God left little sticky notes on everything. For coughs, try this one. For tummy aches, that one over there. Beyond these physical signatures, many plants acquired specific Christian symbolic meanings, a quirky tidbit that further enriched their perceived virtues. Rosemary, as we noted, was associated with remembrance of Christ's suffering, perhaps, or as an aid to remembering prayers and fidelity, making it a favored herb at both weddings and funerals. The very name of sage, salvia, from the Latin salvare to save, would have resonated deeply with the concept of spiritual salvation as well as physical healing. Hyssop, mentioned in the Psalms. Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean, was linked to purification, both physical and spiritual. Even the layout of the garden, the hortus conclusus or enclosed garden, could symbolize the purity of the Virgin Mary or the lost paradise of Eden, making the act of tending it a form of devotion. This layering of spiritual symbolism onto practical herbalism meant that administering a remedy wasn't just a medical act. It was often a spiritual one too, offering comfort to the soul as well as the body. Naturally, prayer was an integral part of the healing process. The infirmarian wouldn't rely solely on the inherent power of the herbs. He would have prayed for guidance in selecting the right plants, for wisdom in their preparation, and for God's blessing to make the remedy effective. The patient, too, would be encouraged to pray, to seek divine assistance in their recovery. The administration of medicine was often accompanied by prayers, blessings, or even readings from Scripture. The herbs were seen as instruments, but the ultimate healing power came from God. The monk was a conduit, a humble assistant in God's work of compassion. It's not that they thought the herbs wouldn't work without prayer, but rather that prayer aligned the whole process with divine will, making it more complete, more holy. This brings us to a fascinating area of ongoing scholarly thought. Theologians and medical historians still argue about the precise balance in the monastic mind. Did they view herbal remedies primarily as tangible, physical agents operating through natural laws established by God? Or were the plants seen more as conduits for divine healing power, their efficacy intrinsically linked to faith, prayer, and God's direct intervention in response to their use? Was it the chemical compounds in the chamomile that soothed? Or was it God's grace flowing through the chamomile, activated by the monk's faith and the patient's prayer? For the medieval monk, this probably wasn't an either-or question. Both were true. The natural and the supernatural were not separate, warring realities, but interwoven aspects of a single divinely ordered cosmos. They'd probably say, of course the plant has properties, God made it that way, and of course prayer helps. God hears us. This holistic view, where the health of the body and the state of the soul were seen as intimately connected, meant that healing was never just a mechanical process. The care provided by the infirmarian, the remedies from the Physic garden, the prayers of the community, all were part of a comprehensive approach to well-being that addressed the whole person. The Physic garden, then, was more than a collection of medicinal plants. It was a sacred space, a living testament to God's care, and a place where faith and practical action converged in the gentle art of healing. Every weeding session a prayer, every harvest a thanksgiving. You've explored the spiritual reverence medieval monks held for their Physic gardens, seeing each plant as a gift from God's verdant pharmacy, often marked with divine signatures to guide their healing hands. This profound belief, intertwined with the practical knowledge gleaned from ancient texts and daily experience, wasn't just passed down through hushed conversations in the infirmary or whispered instructions in the garden. It was also meticulously, painstakingly recorded, ensuring that this vital wisdom of ink, leaf, and legend would endure. So, let's return for a moment to the quiet diligence of the monastery scriptorium. But this time, we're not just watching monks copy ancient Roman scrolls. We're seeing them actively compile and create their own repositories of herbal knowledge. Imagine peering over the shoulder of an infirmarian monk, or perhaps a brother particularly skilled in writing and illustration, as he works on a new herbal manuscript. The room is filled with the familiar scent of ink and parchment, the soft scratch of a quill, but also perhaps the faint, lingering aroma of dried herbs brought in for reference. This isn't just about preserving the words of Dioscorides or Pliny, vital as that was. It's about creating a working guide tailored to the monastery's own specific needs and resources, a unique blend of inherited wisdom and local observation. This is a key mainstream historical fact. Monks didn't just copy older texts, they compiled their own herbals, often augmenting classical knowledge with information about plants found in their own region, and sometimes adding their own observations about efficacy or preparation. These monastic herbals were practical handbooks. They would typically list various plants, providing their names, often in Latin, but sometimes also in the local vernacular to aid identification by less scholarly brothers. Each entry would usually include a description of the plant, its leaves, flowers, stem, roots, where it typically grew. Then, crucially, it would detail the plant's virtues, its medicinal properties, often explained through the lens of the prevailing humoral theory, whether it was hot, cold, wet, or dry in its effects. The manuscript would then describe how to prepare the plant for medicinal use should it be infused as a tisane, decocted by simmering, pounded into a poultice, or incorporated into a salve. Dosages might be suggested, though these were often frustratingly vague by modern standards. A handful, as much as can be held between 3 fingers, or simply a goodly amount. Not exactly precision medicine, but it was the best they had. Finally, the ailments the plant was thought to treat would be listed, anything from a cough or a fever to a wound or a digestive complaint. And Of course, many of these herbals were illustrated. These hand-drawn and painted images were incredibly important. Remember the challenge of identifying a plant based solely on a written description, especially if that description was translated from another language and referred to a plant from a different climate. A picture, even a simple one, that could make all the difference. The illuminators, often monks themselves, would use pigments derived from minerals like lapis lazuli for blue, or red lead for orange red, and plants like weld for yellow, or woad for blue to bring these botanical subjects to life on the parchment. It was a slow, meticulous process, but the results could be both beautiful and functional. Imagine trying to tell your hemlock from your parsley without a good picture. Yikes. This brings us to a wonderfully quirky aspect of these manuscripts, the nature of the illustrations themselves. While some artists aimed for naturalism, many were working under less than ideal conditions. Perhaps they were drawing from dried, pressed specimens, which look very different from vibrant, living plants. Sometimes they might have been working solely from a verbal description or copying an image from an older, already stylized manuscript. This could lead to some wonderfully imaginative and occasionally hilariously inaccurate depictions. Leaves might be a bit too symmetrical, flowers a bit too geometric, colors a bit too vivid. Some plants in these old herbals look less like botanical specimens and more like something out of a Dr. Seuss book. But even these stylized images served a purpose, creating a recognizable, if not perfectly realistic, visual shorthand. The content of these herbals could also be a fascinating mix. Alongside practical advice on well-known herbs, you might find entries on plants with more folkloric or even magical associations. The lines between empirical observation, traditional lore, and Christian interpretation were often quite blurred. For instance, a plant's entry might include not only its medicinal uses, but also the best time to harvest it according to astrological signs, or a specific prayer to be recited while gathering it to enhance its virtues. Connecting back to that spiritual understanding we explored, the creation of these herbals was an act of devotion and scholarship. Each page would be carefully ruled with faint lines to guide the scribe, the text meticulously written with a sharpened quill, leaving spaces for the rubricator to add headings in red ink, and for the illuminator to later paint the illustrations and decorative capitals. It was often a collaborative effort, a testament to the monastery's commitment to preserving and disseminating knowledge. However, art historians and paleobotanists still argue whether the illustrations in monastic herbals were primarily intended as accurate botanical guides for identification in the field, or as artistic embellishments that conveyed a more general, often symbolic, idea of the plant. Sometimes sacrificing literal accuracy for aesthetic appeal, or to fit it into a pre-existing visual tradition. Were they field guides or art books? Probably a bit of both. These precious manuscripts, filled with the collective wisdom of generations, were the infirmarian's most treasured reference tools. They ensured that the knowledge of healing plants, of their signatures, their virtues, and their safe preparation was not lost to time or faulty memory. They were the quiet, enduring legacy of ink, leaf, and legend, carefully cultivated within the peaceful yet ever vigilant walls of the medieval monastery. And every so often, a monk probably drew a little doodle in the margin, just for fun. Perhaps a particularly grumpy-looking mandrake. You've peered over the shoulder of the monastic scribe, watching him meticulously document the virtues of local herbs and ancient remedies in those beautifully crafted herbals, preserving generations of wisdom between an inky finger and a prayerful thumb. These manuscripts were indeed living documents, carefully updated and consulted. But the Physic garden itself, that verdant library of healing plants, wasn't a static collection, frozen in time. Like any great institution of learning and practice, it was open to new acquisitions, sometimes from very distant and unexpected lands. The winds of trade, travel, and even war could carry new seeds, new plants, and new medicinal knowledge right to the monastery gates. While monasteries often projected an image of serene seclusion, a world removed. They were, in reality, nodes in a vast network that crisscrossed medieval Europe and stretched even further afield. And through these connections, exotic arrivals could find their way into the carefully tended beds of the Physic garden, promising new remedies and expanding the infirmarian's toolkit. It wasn't exactly Amazon Prime for rare botanicals, but things did get around, slowly but surely. A major channel for these introductions, a true mainstream historical fact, was through the burgeoning trade routes. Think of the legendary Silk Road, winding its way from the Far East, or the bustling Mediterranean sea lanes connecting Europe with Byzantium, the Levant, and Egypt. Along these routes traveled not just silks and precious metals, but also a wealth of spices and plant-based commodities. You can imagine a visiting merchant, perhaps grateful for some monastic hospitality, presenting the infirmarian with a small pouch of dried ginger from the Orient, lauded for its warming properties and ability to settle an upset stomach. Or perhaps a few precious sticks of cinnamon, or a handful of cloves, which, beyond their culinary allure, were highly prized for their medicinal uses. Cloves, for instance, were a well-known remedy for toothache. These exotic spices were expensive, almost like botanical gold, and any monastery that could procure them would value them highly. Sugar, too, initially arrived as a costly medicine, used to make bitter remedies more palatable or to provide a quick source of energy for the weak, long before it became a common sweetener. Pilgrimage was another significant conduit. Devout monks and indeed laypeople undertook long and arduous journeys to holy sites like Jerusalem, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela. As they traveled through different lands, they would encounter unfamiliar plants and perhaps learn of their local uses from fellow pilgrims or local healers. A returning pilgrim might bring back a few carefully hoarded seeds of a plant reputed to have miraculous healing powers in a distant shrine, or a cutting from a herb that had eased his own travel sickness. These small personal imports could gradually introduce new species to the monastic garden. And then there were the Crusades. While primarily military expeditions, these prolonged encounters between Western Europeans and the cultures of the Middle East inevitably led to an exchange of knowledge, including medical practices and familiarity with new medicinal plants. Arab medicine at this time was, in many respects, more advanced than that of Western Europe. Having preserved and built upon classical Greek texts that were sometimes lost or less well understood in the West, returning crusaders, or clergy who accompanied them, might bring back knowledge of potent remedies like senna, a powerful laxative, or aloes for skin complaints and as a purgative, or even camphor used externally as an analgesic and antiseptic. Imagine the excitement, and perhaps a little trepidation, of the infirmarian upon receiving a handful of strange new seeds or a piece of dried, unfamiliar root. His first challenge would be identification. Could he find any mention of it in his precious texts by Dioscorides or Pliny? Did the traveler bring any clear instructions for its use? Then came the challenge of cultivation, which is a rather quirky aspect to consider. Many of these exotic plants, hailing from warmer, sunnier climes, would have struggled in the often cool, damp conditions of a northern European monastic garden. You can picture Brother Anthony, the dedicated infirmarian, fussing over a tiny, shivering seedling of some Levantine herb, trying to coax it to life through a harsh winter, perhaps rigging up some rudimentary cold frame or giving it the sunniest, most sheltered spot against the infirmary wall. Successfully cultivating a rare and potent exotic would have been a source of great pride and significantly enhanced the monastery's reputation as a center of healing. "Brother, come see, my single ginger shoot has—" Well, it hasn't died yet this week. The arrival of new plants and knowledge necessitated updates to those carefully compiled herbals we discussed. New entries would be made, perhaps with sketches of the unfamiliar plant, notes on its cultivation, and observations on its effects. This information might be compared with existing classical texts. Did this new plant from the East confirm an ancient description? Or was it something entirely novel? It was a slow process of absorption and integration. However, Historians and archaeobotanists still argue about the true extent and speed of these botanical introductions into monastic physic gardens during the High Middle Ages. Was it a slow trickle of a few highly prized exotics, or a more significant influx that substantially diversified the available pharmacopoeia, especially in monasteries with strong external connections through trade or participation in crusades? These exotic arrivals, whether spices, medicinal herbs, or plants that yielded valuable substances like sugar, gradually enriched the monastic pharmacopoeia. They offered new tools in the fight against illness, potentially more effective treatments for certain conditions, and certainly added to the mystique and authority of monastic medicine. It was a slow botanical globalization, a testament to the interconnectedness of the medieval world, even for those living a life ostensibly dedicated to enclosure and contemplation. And you can bet that if a new plant from the Holy Land actually worked, it became the medieval equivalent of a new miracle drug, whispered about in reverent tones from one cloister to the next. You've seen the infirmarian's precious pharmacopoeia expand, not just with local European simples, but also with those intriguing exotic arrivals from distant lands, promising new avenues for healing. You've appreciated the meticulous care with which these plants were documented in monastic herbals. But between the hopeful planting of a seed or sapling and the successful harvesting of a potent remedy lay a battlefield, a constant, quiet struggle against forces that could undo months, even years, of devoted labor. Getting those precious herbs from the soil to the salve was rarely a straightforward affair, and the monks faced their own very real trials in the earth. Imagine that orderly physics garden we've explored, its neat beds and pathways. Now, picture it under siege. The medieval world was not one of climate-controlled greenhouses or scientifically formulated pesticides. The monks, for all their learning and piety, were still profoundly at the mercy of the elements. A late spring frost could nip the tender shoots of newly emerged seedlings, wiping out a whole generation of vital herbs. A prolonged summer drought could wither even the hardiest plants, leaving the infirmarian anxiously scanning the skies for any sign of rain. Conversely, too much rain could lead to waterlogged soil, root rot, and devastating floods that might sweep through the carefully tended beds, carrying away precious topsoil and even more precious plants. Violent hailstorms could shred delicate leaves and flowers in minutes. It was a constant meteorological gamble, and the stakes, the health of their community, were incredibly high. And then there were the pests, an unending legion of tiny saboteurs. You can almost see the infirmarian, his brow furrowed, examining a prized clump of lungwort only to find its leaves riddled with holes. Courtesy of a voracious caterpillar battalion, aphids would suck the life from tender new growth. Slugs and snails would slime their way across carefully cultivated seedlings during the night, and weevils might bore into precious seeds. This is a mainstream historical fact. Medieval agriculture and horticulture were incredibly vulnerable to a host of pests, with very limited means of effective control. Larger marauders also posed a threat. Despite the garden enclosures, resourceful rodents like rats and mice could tunnel in to nibble on roots and stored supplies. Rabbits, if they breached the defenses, could decimate a patch of greens overnight. And in more rural monasteries, even deer might leap a fence to sample the carefully cultivated delicacies. You'd need the patience of a saint, literally, to not get too frustrated with a deer munching on your only mandrake plant. Beyond the visible pests, there were the invisible enemies, the blights, mildews, rusts, and wilts that could spread through a crop with alarming speed, leaving behind blackened leaves and withered stems. The monks would have had little understanding of the fungal or bacterial pathogens causing these diseases, often attributing them to unfavorable weather, bad humors in the soil, or even divine displeasure. Their methods for combating these plant plagues were rudimentary at best, perhaps removing and burning affected plants to try and prevent spread, or hoping a change in the weather would halt the progression. There were no fungicides or antibiotics for their botanical charges. So, what was a medieval monk to do? They weren't entirely helpless. Of course, they practiced manual removal, A novice might be assigned the less than glamorous task of picking caterpillars off the cabbage or squishing snails. Basic traps could be set for rodents. There was also some intuitive understanding of companion planting, the idea that certain herbs, when grown together, might deter pests from each other, though the science behind it was unknown. And this is where we find a rather quirky and very medieval approach, the blending of the practical with the profoundly spiritual. Monks might sprinkle their garden beds with holy water, invoking divine protection. Special prayers would be offered to saints associated with agriculture or healing, like Saint Fiacre, the patron saint of gardeners. In some extreme, documented cases, particularly for large-scale agricultural infestations, church officials even conducted formal excommunication ceremonies for pests like locusts or caterpillars, solemnly banishing them in the name of God. One can only imagine the caterpillar's reaction, or lack thereof. Did you hear that? Lads, we've been excommunicated, more sage for us. Then soil health was another constant concern. While the monks understood the value of manure from their livestock and would have practiced some form of composting with kitchen scraps and garden waste, their knowledge of soil chemistry and nutrient replacement was limited. They might have noticed that plants did better in certain types of soil, or after a particular crop, but systematic soil enrichment and scientifically informed crop rotation were concepts for a much later age. The despair of losing a vital crop must have been immense. Imagine the infirmarian watching a patch of a particularly rare or slow-growing herb, one essential for treating a recurring ailment within the monastery, succumb to blight, or seeing his entire harvest of opium poppies, so crucial for pain relief, destroyed by an untimely storm. It wasn't just the loss of plants, it was the potential loss of his ability to provide comfort and healing. This brings to light an ongoing discussion. Agricultural historians and monastic scholars still argue whether monastic gardening techniques, with their emphasis on order and access to some written knowledge, represented a significantly more advanced or successful form of horticulture compared to lay farming practices of the same period, or if they faced largely the same environmental lottery, with success often boiling down to favorable local conditions, good weather, and a bit of luck. Yet, despite these constant trials in the soil, the monks persevered. Their faith, combined with a stubborn resilience and a deep-seated commitment to their healing mission, kept them returning to the Physic garden, season after season. They would replant, experiment with different locations within the enclosure, share seeds and knowledge with other monastic houses, and always, always pray. This quiet, often frustrating, struggle against the whims of nature was an integral part of the life of the Physic garden, a testament to the enduring human spirit in the face of adversity, all for the sake of a few precious leaves and roots that might bring solace to a suffering world. You've walked with those dedicated monks through their quiet trials in the soil, witnessing their persistent battles against the unpredictable weather, the relentless pests, and the heartbreaking blights that threatened their precious Physic gardens. For centuries, they toiled, prayed, and persevered, their green havens offering solace and healing in a harsh world. But even the most enduring stone walls and the most deeply rooted traditions cannot stand entirely untouched by the grand, sweeping currents of history. As the medieval period gradually gave way to new eras of thought, discovery, and societal upheaval, the central role of monastic medicine and its verdant pharmacies began a slow, profound transformation. The seasons were shifting, not just in the garden, but across the entire landscape of European life. For a vast stretch of time, from the early Middle Ages well into the High Middle Ages, monasteries were indeed the primary engine rooms of medical care and knowledge in many parts of Western Europe. Their infirmarians, guided by ancient texts and practical experience, represented the most consistent and often the most compassionate form of healing available, especially outside the largest cities. That world of hurt we explored earlier found its most reliable solace within their walls. But as the centuries wore on, Other institutions and new ways of thinking began to emerge, gradually altering this long-established order. One of the most significant developments, a key mainstream historical fact, was the rise of universities with dedicated medical faculties. Starting in places like Salerno in Italy, often considered the earliest major medical school in Europe, and later in Montpellier, Bologna, Padua, Paris, Oxford, and elsewhere, a new class of university-trained physicians began to emerge. These scholars delved into the same classical texts that the monks preserved: Hippocrates, Galen, Avicenna, whose Arabic canon of medicine became hugely influential, but often with a more formal, academic, and increasingly secular approach. They underwent structured training, engaged in scholarly debate, and began to form a distinct professional identity, sometimes viewing the more empirical, tradition-based practices of monastic healers or lay herbalists with a degree of academic condescension. You can almost picture a freshly graduated university physician, full of Latin jargon, looking rather skeptically at a monk's simple poultice. My good man, your Galen is admirable, but have you considered the latest scholastic commentaries from Padua on the precise nature of phlegmatic imbalances? Then came a technological revolution, the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century. This was an absolute game changer. Suddenly, medical texts, including herbals and classical treatises, no longer needed to be painstakingly copied by hand in monastic scriptoria. They could be printed in relatively large numbers, making them more affordable and accessible to a wider audience of scholars, physicians, apothecaries, and even literate lay people. This broke the monastery's near monopoly on the preservation and dissemination of such knowledge. The wisdom of Dioscorides was no longer confined to a few precious, locked-away manuscripts. It could be on the bookshelf of any aspiring doctor. The intellectual ferment of the Renaissance also played its part. While it initially involved a passionate rediscovery of classical antiquity, something monasteries had long championed, it also fostered a new spirit of critical inquiry and direct observation. Thinkers like Paracelsus began to challenge the absolute authority of Galen, advocating for chemically prepared medicines alongside or even in place of traditional herbal remedies. Anatomists like Vesalius, through direct human dissection, something generally not practiced in monasteries, began to correct centuries-old errors in the understanding of the human body. Science, as we know it, was taking its very first tentative steps, and this new empirical spirit slowly began to reshape medical thought. And then, in the 16th century, came the Reformation, a religious earthquake that directly and often catastrophically impacted monastic life in many parts of Europe. In Protestant countries like England under Henry VIII, Germany, Scandinavia, and elsewhere, monasteries were dissolved, their lands confiscated, their communities dispersed. This meant the abrupt end of many ancient monastic infirmaries and the destruction or neglect of their carefully tended Physic gardens. Libraries full of precious medical manuscripts were broken up, their contents sometimes lost or destroyed, while the monks themselves might have carried their knowledge with them. The institutional framework that had supported monastic medicine for 1,000 years was, in these regions, dismantled. It was a profound rupture. Historians still argue whether the Reformation's impact on monastic medicine was a catastrophic loss of accumulated knowledge and patient care systems, or if it ultimately acted as a catalyst for the dispersal and secularization of that knowledge into wider society, paving the way for new forms of medical education and public health, even in Catholic countries, which did not experience such wholesale dissolution. The changing intellectual and social climate meant that monasteries gradually ceased to be the undisputed epicenters of medical innovation and care. This brings us to a rather interesting quirky tidbit: the enduring legacy of certain monastic remedies, even as the monasteries themselves faded from medical prominence. Some of their specific herbal recipes or preparations, perhaps a particularly effective cough syrup or a renowned healing salve, outlived them. These brands sometimes passed into folk tradition or were taken up by lay apothecaries, becoming early forms of commercial products. Their monastic origins sometimes forgotten, sometimes romanticized. Think of some famous herbal liqueurs still produced today, often with centuries-old recipes originating from monastic apothecaries, a potent, if slightly intoxicating, echo of their healing past. Another glass of this ancient monastic health tonic. Don't mind if I do. Purely for its historical significance, of course. So you observe not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a slow, creeping obsolescence of the old ways, a fading of their once unquestioned dominance. The Physic garden, once a vital hub, might in some places become a little less central, its remedies supplemented or superseded by new medicines from the apothecary's shop or the university-trained doctor's bag. The infirmarian, while still caring for his brethren, might find his external reputation as a primary healer gradually diminishing. It was a long, slow twilight for a system that had served so faithfully for so long. But the seeds they had sown, both literally and metaphorically, would, as we shall see, find new ground in which to sprout. You've journeyed with us through the shifting seasons of monastic medicine, witnessing its long, influential reign and then its slow, inevitable transformation as new forms of knowledge and new societal structures emerged. That quiet, cloistered world, where the infirmarian monk battled suffering with herbs and prayers, might seem to have faded into a distant, almost mythical past. But the seeds sown in those ancient Physic gardens, both literally and metaphorically, possess a remarkable vitality. Their legacy, like the tenacious roots of some of the very plants they cultivated, runs deep, and you can still find their echoes in the sanctuaries of healing and horticulture we cherish today. The profound knowledge of medicinal plants, so painstakingly preserved and expanded upon within monastery walls for centuries, didn't simply vanish when the great abbeys were dissolved or when university physicians took center stage. It dispersed, certainly, filtering into folk traditions, apothecaries' manuals, and the emerging botanical sciences. This is a key mainstream historical fact. Modern herbalism, while a rich tapestry woven from many global traditions, owes a significant debt to the pharmacopoeia cultivated and documented in medieval monastic Physic gardens. Many of the herbs that were staples for the infirmarian, your trusted friends like sage, thyme, rosemary, chamomile, lavender, calendula, comfrey, and fennel, are still mainstays in herbal practice today, valued for the very same properties the monks identified centuries ago. The tradition of careful observation, of learning from the earth, of using nature's bounty for healing, found a new continuity. Step into a well-tended modern herb garden, or even a dedicated medicinal plant section in a botanical garden, and you'll often find an uncanny resemblance to those medieval monastic layouts. You'll see the same emphasis on orderly beds, perhaps raised for convenience, with clear pathways. Plants might be grouped by use or growing requirements. There's a sense of purpose, a feeling that this is more than just a pretty collection of flowers. It's a living pharmacy, a place of learning and utility, just as it was for Brother Anselm or Brother Cuthbert. The very concept of a Physic garden, a dedicated space for growing healing plants, is one of their most enduring horticultural legacies. It's like they set the original template for functional gardening, and we're still using the blueprints. And here's a delightful, quirky tidbit for you. There's a growing contemporary interest in actively recreating medieval or monastic-style Physic gardens. You can find them lovingly brought to life at historical sites, within botanical gardens, at university departments studying medical history, and even in the ambitious plots of dedicated home gardeners. These reconstructions, based on old plans, manuscript illustrations, and archaeological evidence, serve as wonderful educational tools, allowing us to step back in time and appreciate the skill and knowledge of those early herbalists. Sometimes researchers even discover that specific, ancient strains of certain herbs have quietly persisted for centuries in the grounds of former monastic sites. a direct living link to those medieval cultivators. Imagine finding a patch of sage that is a direct descendant of a plant tended by a 12th century monk. Talk about heritage herbs. The connection isn't just historical curiosity, it touches our modern medicine too. While monks weren't conducting double-blind clinical trials or isolating active chemical compounds, their careful observation of what worked was part of a long, slow chain of discovery. Many modern pharmaceuticals have their origins in plant-derived substances first identified and used in traditional medicine. Aspirin from willow bark. The heart medication digitalis from foxglove, a plant monks knew to be powerful and dangerous. Quinine from cinchona bark. These are just a few examples. The monks' Physic gardens were early laboratories in this ongoing human quest to understand and utilize the healing power of nature. They probably wouldn't understand a modern pharmacy with its blister packs and synthesized drugs, but they'd recognize the underlying quest. Aspirin. You say we just called it chew some willow bark and pray the headache away. But good on you for branding it. Lads, beyond the specific plants or remedies, perhaps the most profound legacy is the idea of the garden itself as a sanctuary, a place for healing not just of the body, but also of the mind and spirit. The quiet, ordered beauty of the Physic garden, the gentle labor of tending it, the connection with the natural rhythms of growth and decay, these things have a therapeutic power that transcends any specific medicinal compound. Today, we see this reflected in the rise of therapeutic horticulture, in the creation of healing gardens in hospitals and community centers, and in the simple solace that so many people find in their own green spaces. The monks knew, intuitively, that being surrounded by growing things by the quiet wisdom of nature was good for the soul. This enduring connection, however, leads to complex modern considerations. Ethnobotanists and medical historians still argue about the most effective and ethical ways to integrate the vast traditional knowledge of medicinal plants, meticulously preserved and developed by communities like the medieval monks, with the rigorous demands of modern scientific research and contemporary healthcare systems. How do we respect and learn from ancient wisdom while ensuring safety and efficacy by today's standards? It's a conversation that continues, echoing those earlier debates within monastic walls about the balance between faith, tradition, and observation. So, the next time you sip a calming chamomile tea, or rub a calendulous salve on a minor burn, or simply enjoy the fragrance of lavender in a garden, take a moment. You are partaking in a tradition that stretches back through centuries, tended by quiet hands and cloistered havens, a tradition that believed in the gentle, persistent power of the earth to heal. The seeds of their devotion, their knowledge, and their compassion continue to blossom in countless ways, a quiet green thread running through the often chaotic tapestry of human history. Now, as our exploration of these ancient green sanctuaries draws to its natural end, allow the quietude of the medieval cloister to settle around you. The diligent work of the infirmarian is done for the day. The Physic garden rests under the soft light of the moon, its potent fragrances mingling with the cool night air. Each plant, a silent promise of solace, stands sentinel, holding within its leaves and roots the accumulated wisdom of generations, a testament to nature's enduring power to nurture and restore. Think of those monks, moving through their ordered world, finding in the cultivation of these special herbs not just a practical duty, but a profound connection to the divine, a way to manifest their compassion for a suffering world. The gentle rustle of leaves in their garden was perhaps a prayer, the careful preparation of a remedy, an act of devotion. They sought to understand the signatures of God in every blossom, every stem, believing that healing was a sacred partnership between human effort and heavenly grace. Let that sense of peaceful purpose, of quiet dedication, seep into your own awareness as you prepare for sleep. The anxieties of the modern world can fade, just as the harshness of the medieval world was sometimes softened by the gentle care found within those monastery walls. There is a deep comfort in knowing that the search for healing, for understanding, for a touch of grace in a troubled world, is a timeless human endeavor, The seeds of that ancient quest are still within us, still growing, still offering hope. And now, it is time to rest.